Welcome back to the PolicyViz Podcast. I'm your host, JonSchwabish. I hope you're having an enjoyable start to your holiday season. I am enjoying sharing with you the last episode of the podcast for 2024. But don't worry, I've got lots of great episodes coming your way in 2025, all about helping you do a better job visualizing your data, communicating your data, presenting your data. We're going to talk about lots of different tools like Tableau, Atlas.ai, and lots of other things. So make sure you stay tuned to the show. Make sure you get it in your feed on iTunes, on Spotify, or on YouTube if you're watching the show there. So on this week's episode of the show, I'm excited to be joined by author and R expert, R enthusiast, DavidKeyes, author of the new book, R for the Rest of Us. This is a really interesting book because it doesn't focus on how do you clean data, how do you run regressions, how do you do estimates. It's all about using R to communicate data. So he starts with data visualization. He gets into data workflow issues like Quarto and RMarkdown. It's a really fascinating book, and we focus our attention in our discussion on these various elements of communicating data through R. So we spend a lot of time talking about Quarto and RMarkdown and the difference between the two if you don't know. We talk a lot about tables because tables are such an interesting part of visualizing data, and there are some great ways to do that in R. And then we spent a bunch of time talking about themes and functions that can help you create more consistent branded visualizations, either within your organization or just for yourself, if you want to have a consistent look and feel to your graphs and your charts and your maps and whatever else you're creating in R. So if you are relatively new to R, I think this will be a great episode for you because David's going to walk you through how to use some of these other features that you may be a little hesitant to try out. But as you're going to hear, anyone can do this in R. The features, the packages, the libraries are there for you to help you create better graphs and charts and all other visual elements in R. So no more talking from me. Let's get right to the episode. So here's my conversation with DavidKeyes, author of the new book, R for the Rest of Us, a statistics-free introduction. Hi, David. Welcome to the show. Good to. I don't think we've ever met, so good to meet you, like virtually at least.
Yeah, great to meet you as well, John. I've followed your work for a while, and I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. So, new book, R for the Rest of Us. I do like the subtitle, a statistics-free introduction, so it doesn't scary enough to learn how to code. A little less scary when you don't have to learn like statistics while you code. So I thought we would start simply with introductions, and then how you sort of got to writing a book about R.
Sure. Yes, I'm David. I run a website, a business called also R for the Rest of Us. I've been doing this for about 5, almost 6 years now. I have an unusual path to where I am. I actually did a PhD in anthropology, and my dissertation was entirely qualitative. But after I graduated, I realized I actually like doing quantitative work as well, and was working in what's called evaluation. So I tell people it's kind of like management consulting for like nonprofit or government. And I was an Excel user, and did that, and then realized I wanted to learn something else. Taught myself R, and then started a business to kind of help other people like me who wanted to learn R, but maybe didn't come from that quantitative background like so many R users do.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it, and the book came out. I worked on the book for a couple of years, and then it finally came out a few months ago. So it's been
Right.
exciting to see it out there.
And were you? I guess this sort of bleeds into my first main question, which is, writing a book about a coding language can be kind of tricky, right? Because especially a tool like R, where it's constantly changing, people are creating
Right.
new libraries and new packages and new techniques. How did you make that decision that a book would be the best way for folks to learn rather than, using Google or ChatGPT and, all the various sites people can sort of go to?
Yeah, I had before I wrote the book, and I still do make video courses.
Hmm.
So that's the main way I had been teaching. But just through talking to people, I know that, there's certain people who really like learning through online courses, and there's certain people who really like books.
Mm,
And so I don't necessarily think that books are the best way, nor are video courses necessarily the best way. I think they're just different ways.
mm,
And so, yeah, I wanted to provide, an opportunity for folks who like that. I know that people also like books. Even in an era of ChatGPT, a lot of people like having even the physical book to be able to mark it up, to, have as a reference. So I think, again, just giving opportunity, various options for people who want to learn in different ways was a big part of the motivation to write the book.
right. It's interesting to me. I mean, your book, similar, I think, to Hadley Wickham's book, but different from a lot of other R books, starts with data visualization. And the book, I think, primarily focuses on the communication possibilities with R, the
Yeah.
exporting, the collaboration, the visualizations. Did you ever have a part of yourself that was like, I really need to show folks how to do like regression analysis and data cleaning and all those pieces? Kind of like, I think in the workflow, you kind of, lots of people think about the data communication piece towards the end, which may or may not be
Right.
right. But
Right.
like,
Right.
there's like, how do you clean the data, all of those pieces. But I mean, just so folks, in case folks haven't sort of looked into it very quickly, like part one, there are five chapters in part one that is visualizations. There are five chapters in part two that are reports, presentations, and websites. And then the last section is automation and collaboration. So none of that is like data cleaning, regression
Yeah.
analysis, right? So like, what were you thinking of the guide and like your target reader?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, for me, never going to make a section on anything statistical because given my background and my kind of approach with R, a lot of what I've wanted to do is show people that, even if you never do complex statistics, R can be still incredibly useful because that's exactly how I use it.
Mm-hmm.
I do R for the rest of us. We also do some consulting work, and the reports that we make for clients, the most complex statistics we're doing are like means and medians, that type of thing. And again, we get a huge amount of value out of it. And so I wanted the book to be a way to show people that you don't have to use R in that way, because I think everybody already knows, if you're doing statistics, R obviously is a fantastic tool for that. But really, I also wanted to show people that it could do more than that. And actually, the original title of the book was R Without Statistics.
Mm.
That was the working title for a long time. Um, and eventually, my publisher decided, working together, we decided to shift it and make that more like the subtitle, as you mentioned. But hopefully, that shows you kind of the motivation behind the book. You asked also about the kind of like intended audience. I think it's two groups of people. Number one is people who have never used R. There's a chapter early on that's just like a crash course in how R works. And that comes from the years of experience I have teaching folks who have never used R. But then number two is more experienced R users who have maybe gotten in their head that R is only useful for certain things. And oftentimes that's, more statistically oriented tasks. And so showing people that, hey, R can help you with like incredible data viz or improving your reporting workflow. I think that is something that even many experienced users don't appreciate, the value of R.
Yeah. Uh, what is your experience on the qualitative? You said you started like with anthro degree, and I'm curious about the qualitative part of working with R. I can't think of a time I've really
Yeah,
gone in there, but like there are new NLP packages coming out. I mean, I know there's a word tree package, but okay, but
right,
like,
right, right, right.
how do you have you really dug into the qualitative side of things in R?
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, people ask me that, um, and I'm always looking for an answer because I get asked that so much.
Right.
But no, at this point, I don't really do very much with qualitative data in R.
Mm.
Um, so Yeah, I don't know that I actually have a ton to offer there. It's
Yeah,
more
I
just
mean,
that that's my background.
right, right. I
So
mean, there are other tools, in Vivo and Deduce and some others,
right.
and so maybe folks are just living in those tools and say, okay, like,
I've
you know,
seen people um, try to combine the tools, and there've also been like packages that people have made to attempt to do the kinds of things that like in Vivo or Deduce or those things do, where
mm,
you are doing that more kind of manual tagging of qualitative data and looking for themes and that type of thing. I, actually, the one thing I will say I have done, I connected R to using ChatGPT
mm,
and said, go in, like, here's my data, here's my survey.
yeah,
I mean, I was using fake data. I know there are privacy reasons why you
right,
have to
yeah,
be
yeah,
careful
yeah,
how
yeah,
you do this, but I just wanted to see would this be possible. And so yeah, I hooked up R to ChatGPT, gave it some fake survey data, and said, pull out the top 3 themes in this
wow,
data. So yeah, it could be used in that way,
right,
but I don't generally use it for a lot of
yeah.
qualitative analysis.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in that area
Yeah,
over the next coming months, years, I guess. Um, okay, so there are three parts of the book that I found especially unique and innovative that I want to talk about. You have a whole section on tools. I'm sorry, on tables. You have a whole section on templates, and then you have a whole chapter on RMarkdown and Quarto. So I want to start on tables. From your perspective, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of using R for creating tables?
sure. Well, first of all, I will actually say I think this is in the book. Hopefully, you pick this up. The tables chapter was actually inspired by you because you have an article about effective tables,
Yeah.
and then Tom Mock, who works at Posit, took that and showed how you would implement those principles in R using a package called GT.
Hmm.
And so then I interviewed the way the book is structured. Each chapter is framed around an interview with someone who's using R, in daily life to do something. So I interviewed Tom for that chapter and talked about how you implement those principles.
Yeah.
So, as to your questions about advantages and disadvantages of using R to create tables, if you're already doing your reporting in R, if you're using a tool like RMarkdown or Quarto, which I know we'll talk about shortly, um, I think doing tables in R is absolutely the best way to go. And the way I tell people, or the reason why I think it is that is because if you think about a more typical workflow or a typical workflow for someone who's not using R, say
Hmm.
they're using a tool like SPSS or SAS or Stata, and say, you get your data, you do your data cleaning and your analysis in that tool, and then you kind of have to spit out, that you have to export your data, and then you copy it into Word and you make your tables in Word.
Right.
Now, if you just do that once, sure, that's fine. But the reality is, for most people, you're not typically doing that once. Like maybe you edit your Word document, you have to go back and like create your table again, or
Yeah.
you say if
Yeah.
you're doing surveys, like you get 10 additional surveys. Well, then you have to run your analysis in SPSS or SAS or Stata or whatever, spit out your data, copy it to Word. And every time you are copying from one tool to another is a chance of, human error. And I mean, I think anybody who works with data knows that it's just going to happen. There's no way
Hmm.
around it. And so with R, what you can do is you can work with your data, do all of your analysis within R, and then do what's called piping it directly into the GT package or any other package to make tables. And so while it doesn't totally, I mean, there's always the possibility of human error. You can make an error in your code, of
Right.
course, but you're avoiding that copy paste error. So I think that's like kind of the major advantage. Plus, as I talk about in the chapter, the GT package, especially, is set up with some really nice defaults that make it so that you basically have to work to mess up your tables, As an example, it will automatically right align numeric data so that it aligns and it's easier to read and compare. Um, and as I show in the chapter, like you can change that, but that's the default, which is
Hmm.
really helpful. When it comes to disadvantages, and I don't think this is specific to tables, I think this is specific to R. There's a learning curve.
Yeah.
And R, I mean, I know you did an episode of this podcast where you worked with Aaron Williams and you talked about yourself learning R. And I think that's a good example of, it's challenging. And
Yeah.
so I think you have to see it as a long-term investment to learn R, because that workflow that I talked about where you're working in R and making your tables automatically will save you time in the long term. But the first couple times you do it, it's definitely not going to save you time.
Yeah.
So I think that's the major disadvantage.
Yeah. It's also, especially with tables, that there just feels like there's infinitely more variations in a standard table than in, say, like a bar chart, right? Like a bar
Right.
chart, you're going to have axis, rectangles.
Right.
Do you want, the infrastructure is kind of all set. Whereas tables, like, are you going to have one that spans multiple columns? Are you going to break the grid lines? Like, it's just it.
Right.
And yeah, like you said, like you got to kind of iterate through it to figure out how you want to make those tables look good each time.
Yep.
So that segues very nicely into the next thing I wanted to ask about was templates, because you have a whole section on templates, which I'm a big fan of. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, about building templates, and then particularly, I guess, as we think, or just go back kind of to tables, like, how do you think about building? This is something I've always struggled with, because I'm always asked, like, can you build a table template for us
Mm-hmm.
in Excel or PowerPoint or whatever? And I've always sort of pushed back on that because there's so many variations on a table. So
Right.
maybe we could just start with like the table section in general, and why you felt that was key to someone learning R, and then we could talk about that. It's kind of what I see as like this table template challenge.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I think learning to make effective tables is useful is because it's something that everybody is going to do. No matter what else you're doing in R, everybody at some point is going to make a table.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that out because when I first started learning R, because I'm an anthropologist, because I'm not doing statistically complicated things, I actually felt really kind of uncertain, like, oh, am I a real R user? And then I started talking to people and everyone was like, yeah, I mean, sure, some people are doing more complex statistics, but the tips and tricks that get shared online that resonate with everybody are things like how to make good tables, how to make good data viz. Um, and so I think for that reason, it's really useful to think about making table, like everybody will want to learn how to make tables.
Yeah.
I actually forgot your other questions.
Well, just generally on templates of, yeah, I guess maybe I'll put it this way: like, walk us, for folks who haven't picked up the book yet, and obviously they should, and they will after this episode. But like, walk us through the templates section, and I guess why. I'm not really sure how to ask this question. I guess it is an extension of what you mentioned earlier, like the advantages of R, and then taking all those advantages and sort of like packaging it together in a template.
Yeah. So, and I assume now we're talking about kind of RMarkdown or Quarto, those types of
Yeah, or
templates, right?
even I know you talked to Aaron over at Urban and a couple others, like even in the ggplot themes, like why you see that as valuable.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'll actually start with the idea of tables, and then I'll move on to
Yeah,
ggplot and RMarkdown. So with R, because it's a coding language, you can, if you've written code to make a table and say, you have a style guide for your organization where the top row is always bold, 12-point Arial font, or, whatever it
yeah,
is, you code that once, then you can turn it into what's called a function, which is just a kind of reusable piece of code. And you can then, if I have like a table function called like table DK, anytime I want to make a table, I don't have to remember the 20 lines of code that I used to make the table. I just type table DK and it will format it in that way. And I know you talked about, with Excel or PowerPoint, like the challenges making a template because, well, it might vary in different ways. With R, one cool thing you can do is when you make a function, you can add what are called arguments so that you can say, I don't know, say sometimes you want to use Arial for your header font, but other times you want to use some other font. Well, you can set the argument for, header font equals, and then you can change it. And so you can make a kind of basic template, but you also give a little bit of flexibility for those who want to change it. And it's the exact same thing with ggplot, which is the main way that folks make data viz in R. There it's called a theme. So there's a chapter in the book where I interview folks at the BBC who made a theme for data viz, and their theme has arguments that you can use. So say sometimes you want to include your X and Y grid lines. Sometimes you don't want them. You can add arguments to give you that flexibility. And when it comes to kind of RMarkdown or Quarto, which are tools for what's typically referred to in a kind of wonky way as reproducible research or reproducible reporting, what that means is just it allows you to combine your text and code all in one document. And you use that then to kind of render your document to some usable format like Word or PDF or HTML. And I know I talked before about, the typical workflow of going from like SPSS to Word. The way I typically talk about RMarkdown or Quarto, which are really very similar tools, is with a typical workflow. Say you'd work in SPSS, do your data analysis, then you spit out your clean data to Excel. You use that to make your charts. You copy your charts into Word, then you write your report in Word, add your tables there as well. With R Markdown or Quarto, you're doing that entirely within R. And so where you want to make data viz, for example, you add the code that makes the charts. Same thing with the tables. But then you also have that narrative text alongside it. And it's only when you hit, there's a button, a render button that allows you then to export to something. And that facilitates, if you need to make a report every month, well, no problem. You just write your code. Every time you want to render it with your new data, you just hit that render button and it spits out a new report. Or in the case of what the folks at Urban were doing, they're using a technique called parameterized reporting, where, say you want to make one report for each state in the US. Well, doing that manually is a ton of work, incredibly error prone. They have created R Markdown templates that they then use and write some additional code and iterate to say, okay, first make a report for Alaska, then for Alabama, then Arizona, all the way down through all the states.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the Quarto R Markdown language in a second. But for folks who are listening to this who may be earlier on in their R learning experience education, I would suspect that many of them sort of, when they hear the words functions and building themes, that's a little intimidating. Like,
Sure.
is should they feel intimidated about writing functions and writing themes, or is it, is it just a simple extension of the existing R language that is something that really anybody can do in their learning of the tool?
Yeah, I mean, I would not recommend starting out when you're learning R by trying to create your own ggplot theme. Definitely not.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the cool thing is, because R is open source, so many other people have created themes. And so you can rely on, you can use other people's themes. Like, I don't know why I would want to do this, but if I wanted to make plots in the Urban Institute style, I could use the theme package that you all have made to make plots in that style. I can make BBC style themes. So I think for most people starting out, for a long time when you're learning R, you're relying on other people's code that they have written. And that's great because it makes it a lot easier. But eventually you get to a point where you're like, oh, I want to tweak this a little bit. And then you realize, wait, if I can, write my own themes or my own functions, I can do this in a way that I can customize it to my exact needs.
Yeah. But it's also advantageous, like take the urban theme or the BBC theme, right? Like you could get that and then you could go under the hood and
Yep.
say to your point, you don't want to use the Lato font. You like the urban color, you like everything about urban except for the font, right? You can just change that one argument and then you have a whole new thing.
Yeah, and that's how a lot of people do it. They'll when they're, for example, making their own theme, they don't necessarily start from scratch. They'll look
Yeah.
at what other people have done and then adapt it based on that. So
Right.
yeah, that's a great way to go.
So I want to get back to the Quarto and RMarkdown. So maybe it is interesting because I know like our folks at Urban are very much into Quarto, but when I talk to other people in other organizations, I don't know why. Maybe it's just a take up situation. Like I still know a lot of people who haven't even heard of Quarto and they're still using RMarkdown. But I was wondering if you could talk about kind of the difference between the two, and then what are the advantages of. I mean, I guess kind of either because they're they have their own advantages, but like why folks should start to get into the knitting and the rendering of a Markdown language.
Yeah. So, well, I'll give a little bit of the backstory, which is I started writing this book before Quarto had come out. So most of the book covers our Markdown with a chapter that I added that kind of compares the two and talks about the major differences. I will say overall, the differences between our Markdown and Quarto are very minor. It's
Mm.
about kind of like where you place arguments in code chunks. I'm trying not to get too overly technical for
Yeah.
folks who might not be R users, but I've worked with many people who have been longtime R Markdown users who have looked into Quarto and said, "Oh, I want to do it. I don't know if it's going to be too much work." And I tell them just try it, and they do,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really not that different. So what I say in the book is the difference between the workflow that I described before, the kind of SPSS to Excel to Word workflow, the difference between that and like an R Markdown workflow is huge. Like that's incredibly
Yeah.
different. But compared to that, switching between R Markdown and Quarto is negligible. So in terms of differences, I don't know that there's a huge amount. I mean, I will say Posit, the company who is behind both R Markdown and Quarto, has said R Markdown's not going away. But when it comes to kind of new features,
Mm-hmm.
they'll be focusing those on Quarto. And so, as an example, this has actually just come out, and I haven't actually fully explored it, but they're releasing this. I don't know if it's a package or kind of approach using a file, a kind of brand.yaml file,
Mm.
which allows you to, and this is just working within Quarto, not within our Markdown, allows you to define kind of brand specification. So you define colors in brand colors in one place. You define, you set your brand logos. Say if you have like multiple versions of your logo, you can define those, and then you can use that with throughout Quarto documents, as well as I think within the ideas it'll eventually be able to apply. You'll be able to apply that pretty easily to things like tables and ggplot themes. So that's not covered in the book because that literally has just
Right.
come out.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing that I think you're likely to see in Quarto that is not necessarily going to exist in our Markdown. But overall, I'd say if you're already using our Markdown and it's working for you, I don't necessarily think you need to, go
Need to
running to
switch.
switch. But if you
Yeah.
are starting out fresh, I'd probably go with Quarto at this point.
And for folks who've never worked in a Markdown language, aside from having to learn the syntax and all
Sure.
that, and my experience has been it's more of a structure of sort of build it. Like it's still the same R code. It's just built kind of in a different structure.
Yep.
But from your perspective, like what are the advantages, the big advantages of going to either either R Markdown or Quarto rather than just working in sort of the base
Like
R?
an R script
Yeah,
file.
like an R script or in our, I guess, yeah, like an R script. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the big advantage is with the whole kind of reproducible reporting workflow that it allows you to do your entire report. You can set up all the text and all the code, and then you can automatically generate reports. So, like my party trick when I'll occasionally do like webinars where I'll show people, here's the value of learning R, is I will set up a survey. I'll do it on usually on Google Sheets or sorry on Google Forms. Um, and then at the beginning of the webinar, I'll tell people, okay, go fill out this survey. I mean, it's like a 4-question survey just to give me a little bit of data. They'll fill it out. And then I have set up my document, either in RMarkdown or Quarto, such that it will go out, grab that data from Google Sheets, because I pipe the data from the Google form into a Google Sheet. It'll grab it, automatically summarize it. I have text, for example, at the top of my document that says, X number of people filled out the survey today. And that X can be automatically updated, based on the data. And so that type of workflow is possible using RMarkdown or Quarto. Whereas if you're using just an R script file,
Hmm.
you still have to do that manual, say you make a plot, for example, in an R script file. Well, then you still have to copy that into Word, for example.
Right.
And that's both less efficient and, potentially error prone as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting to think about how these workflows can and maybe should change. And also, I find the Quarto Markdown piece is easier to share a lot of things because you just send
Sure.
an HTML file and it's one thing. You have everything sort of knitted together, as opposed to, like, as you said, like copying and pasting all these different places.
Well, and I'll even do things where I'll create an HTML file, and there are ways you can kind of set it up online, and you just give people the URL, and then anytime you have new data, you just render it again,
Right.
republish it, and people just go to that same URL to get the
Yeah.
automatically up to date data.
No, so on that point, so I'm sure people are thinking, okay, so where do you send it, or where are you putting it on your website as like an unpublished page, or to your site, and you're just sharing that URL with folks?
Yeah, so I use a tool called Netlify typically. You have to, there are a number of ways to use it. But I connect to GitHub. So I connect Netlify to a GitHub repository and set it up. And I tell Netlify, hey, anytime there are changes on this GitHub repository, go and grab the latest version of the report and update it. So then Netlify creates a URL that I
Right.
share with people.
Love it.
So it's like kind of like one-off URLs that I make.
Right.
And I can set passwords and that kind of thing as well. If I don't want the
Yeah.
data available for anybody.
Yeah, that's great. You've talked about workflow a bunch in our chat, and I've heard you say, or maybe I don't know if you wrote it or I heard it in one of your talks, but I've heard you say that R is a workflow tool that also happens to do some stats. And we've talked a lot about that today, but I was hoping maybe you could, I don't know, crystallize it for folks.
Yeah. Well, that's my that's my perspective on R, given that I'm, an anthropologist who came to R who does not use R for much in the way of statistics. Um, and it was really, like I mentioned before, I was really kind of insecure for a while about my R use, feeling like, oh, I'm not a real R user. Um, and it was only when I realized like how much it was improving my workflow that I was like,
Mm.
no, you know what, this is actually really valuable. And it comes back to things like the reproducible reporting with R Markdown and Quarto, parameterized reporting, especially making multiple reports at one time. I mean, we have one client who we work with who he works for um, it's called the San Diego County Office of Education. They work with school districts throughout San Diego County in California, and he has to make reports for every single student. That's like 10,000 students. I mean, there's just no way you're going to do
No,
that, in Excel
you're
and
right.
Word.
Yeah.
So R facilitates that, and I think it's a great tool to improve your workflow in so many ways I hadn't even really considered when I first started learning it.
Right. Okay, so the book is R for the Rest of Us. Folks should obviously get it wherever you get your books. You should check it out. If folks have questions for you, David, follow up, they want to learn more, where can they find you?
Sure. So the website is just rfortherestofus.com. If you want to learn more about the book, you can go to rfortherestofus.com/book. And people should feel free to email me. I'm old school. Email is a good way to reach out to me. It's just david@rfortherestofus.com.
Awesome. David, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was fun. I'm excited for R for the Rest of Us second edition. That'll go into all the Quarto stuff and all the other changes. So, but this is fun. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. Make sure you check out David's site. Make sure you check out his book. And while you're at it, you're taking a little break this holiday season, see if you can take a moment to rate or review the show on your favorite podcast provider. You can do the same thing on YouTube. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get it. And if you have a moment, rate or review the show or rate or review my books on Amazon or Goodreads, wherever you get them. Again, I'm just trying to share this information, sharing the learnings so that people can do a better job of using and communicating their data. So this wraps up the show for 2024. I hope you'll have a happy holiday season. And so until next time, until 2025, this is the PolicyViz Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.